An 11-year-old girl cradled the billionaire's crying son in an unthinkable way, and when he saw it, his entire world cracked open. The words cut through the mansion's silence like shattered glass. What is the meaning of this? Harrison Caldwell's voice was low, but dangerous, the kind of sound that makes the air itself tighten. In the center of the gleaming kitchen stood Grace Jensen, just 11 years old, her pale hair pulled back, her small frame trembling. But it wasn't her that froze the billionaire in disbelief. It was the sight of his 6-month-old son, Leo, strapped securely to her back with a faded scrap of olive green fabric. For the first time in months, the baby wasn't screaming. He was calm, even curious. Harrison's pulse quickened with fury. This was reckless, primitive. But what he couldn't yet see was that this moment would change everything. An 11-year-old girl was the only one who could make the billionaire's baby stop crying. So when he found her with his son tied to her back, he did the one thing he thought was right. The words were a blade, sharp and cold in the pristine air of the kitchen. What is the meaning of this? Harrison Caldwell stood in the arched doorway, his expensive suit looking like armor. His face, usually controlled and unreadable, was a mask of disbelief turning rapidly to fury. He was a man who controlled a global logistics empire, a man for whom every minute was scheduled, every outcome predicted. This scene in his own home was an unforgivable error in the system. There, by the gleaming stainless steel island, stood 11-year-old Grace Jensen. She was small for her age, with hair the color of pale corn silk tied back in a simple ponytail. Her worn jeans and faded t-shirt looked out of place against the kitchen's stark, architectural perfection. But it wasn't the girl that made Harrison's blood run cold. It was his son, 6-month-old Leo, who was tied securely to Grace's back. He was nestled in a makeshift sling, fashioned from a soft, faded olive green fabric. The baby, who for months had filled the mansion with his tortured, inconsolable wails, was utterly silent. His head rested on Grace's shoulder, his eyes wide and curious, watching her chop carrots with a focused calm Harrison had never seen in him. A tiny fist clutched a piece of her blonde hair, not in distress, but with a quiet contentment that felt alien in this house of grief. "Get him off of you," Harrison commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Right now, Grace flinched, her hand freezing over the cutting board. She turned slowly, her blue eyes wide with a fear that tore at her mother, Laura, who was scrubbing the nearby stovetop. Laura's hands, red and chapped from cleaning chemicals, froze in the soapy water. "Mr. Caldwell, please," Laura began, her voice trembling as she wiped her hands on her apron. "I can explain. You were just what?" Harrison directed his glare at Grace, stepping further into the room. "Endangering my son? Is that part of your mother's job description? Letting her child play with him like he's some kind of doll?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Grace clutched the edge of the counter, feeling Leo's small body warm against her back. The sling, the source of the baby's first real peace, was now the source of this terrifying storm. What he couldn't see, what his anger wouldn't let him comprehend, was that the faded green fabric was more than just a piece of cloth. It was the lining of a hero's jacket. And in that moment of blind rage, he was about to dishonor a legacy he couldn't possibly understand and destroy the only hope his son had. 3 months earlier, the notice was taped to the apartment door, its stark red letters a declaration of war. Final eviction warning. Laura Jensen stared at it, her shoulders slumping with a weight that felt heavier than the laundry basket in her arms. Inside their small, cramped apartment, the smell of burnt toast and cheap air freshener hung in the air. This 2-bedroom space on the forgotten side of town was the only home Grace had ever known. It was where they had pieced their lives back together after Grace's father had left, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a quiet, unfillable hole in their family. "Mom," Grace asked from the small kitchen table, where she was meticulously cleaning a set of silver medals. "Is it about the rent again?" Laura forced a smile that didn't reach her tired eyes. "Just a friendly reminder from the landlord, sweetie. Nothing to worry about." But Grace knew better. At 11, she understood the language of worry better than most adults. She saw it in the way her mother skipped meals, claiming she wasn't hungry. She saw it in the well-hidden stack of unpaid bills in the desk drawer. And she heard it in the long, quiet sighs that escaped her mother's lips late at night, when she thought Grace was asleep. Their financial troubles had started as a slow leak and turned into a flood. Laura worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and waitressing on weekends. But a sudden illness had wiped out their meager savings. Pneumonia had settled deep in her lungs, forcing her out of work for 6 critical weeks. The medical bills arrived like clockwork, each one a fresh wave of panic. Now, back on her feet, but hopelessly behind, she felt like she was drowning. Grace looked down at the medals in her hands. They belonged to her great-grandfather, Sergeant Thomas Stonewall Jensen. He was the family legend, a man who had earned the Medal of Honor in a war fought long before she was born. His dress uniform hung in a protective bag in Laura's closet, and his medals lived in a velvet-lined box on the mantelpiece. Polishing them was Grace's weekly ritual, her way of connecting to the hero she had never met. There was the Silver Star for gallantry, the Purple Heart for being wounded in the line of duty, and the most important one, the Medal of Honor. The story behind it was Grace's favorite. Pinned down by enemy fire, her great-grandfather's platoon had been shattered and terrified. He had crawled through mud and fire, not to attack, but to rescue his wounded men. He had carried them, one by one, back to safety. The official report said he used his own field jacket to create a makeshift sling for a young soldier who couldn't walk, carrying him for over a mile under constant threat. He never left a man behind, Laura would tell her, her voice filled with a quiet pride that was the foundation of their family. He used to say that true strength isn't about how hard you can fight. It's about how much you're willing to carry for someone else. That jacket now rested in the velvet box, too fragile to be handled often. But its soft, worn-out lining, a piece of olive green flannel, had been carefully removed and preserved by Grace's grandmother. It was their family's most sacred relic. It smelled of history, of courage, and of a quiet, stubborn love. The phone rang, jarring them from their thoughts. It was a number from a wealthy suburb on the other side of the state, a place they only saw on television. Hesitantly, Laura answered. "Is this Laura Jensen?" a crisp, professional voice asked. "My name is Mrs. Gable. I am the household manager for the Caldwell estate. I'm calling about your application." Laura's heart leaped. She had sent out dozens of applications for live-in housekeeping positions, a desperate last-ditch effort to find a situation that offered a steady paycheck and, most importantly, a roof over their heads. Most had gone unanswered. "Yes, this is she," Laura said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your references are excellent," Mrs. Gable continued, her tone all business. "The position is for a head housekeeper. It is a live-in role, 6 days a week. The salary is substantial, enough to solve your immediate problems, I would imagine. However, the demands are specific. The previous 4 housekeepers have not met Mr. Caldwell's standards." For in how long? Laura wondered, but she didn't dare ask. "The position also requires that your daughter, Grace, adhere to a strict set of rules," Mrs. Gable added. "She will be permitted to reside with you in the staff quarters. She is not to be seen or heard in the main house unless absolutely necessary. She is to remain in your quarters during her non-school hours. Do you understand?" The words were cold, clinical. Grace was not a child to them. She was a complication to be managed. Laura looked at her daughter, who was watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. This wasn't a choice. It was a lifeline. "We understand completely," Laura said, her voice filled with a determination that echoed her grandfather's famous resolve. "When can we start?" The taxi ride to the Caldwell estate was like traveling to another planet. They left the cracked pavement and graffitied walls of their neighborhood behind, moving through pristine suburbs where manicured lawns looked like green carpets. Finally, they turned onto a private road that wound through a dense forest before opening up to a set of imposing iron gates. The gates swung open silently, revealing a house that looked less like a home and more like a modern art museum. It was all sharp angles, glass walls, and stark white stone, perched on a hill overlooking a vast, shimmering lake. It was beautiful in the way a perfectly cut diamond was beautiful, brilliant, expensive, and cold. Mrs. Gable met them at the massive front door. She was a tall, thin woman in a severe gray suit, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at her face. Her eyes scanned them from head to toe, her expression betraying nothing. "Laura, Grace," she said, her voice as starched as her collar. "Welcome to the estate. Leave your bags. The staff will take them to your quarters." Their quarters consisted of two small, plain rooms in a wing of the house that felt miles away from the main living area. The rooms were clean and functional, but had all the charm of a hospital. Still, there was a window that looked out onto a small, neat garden, and for the first time in months, Laura felt a sliver of hope. Mrs. Gable gave them the tour, her heels clicking in unnerving rhythm on the polished marble floors. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by her voice. Abstract paintings hung on the walls, their chaotic colors a stark contrast to the home's rigid order. The furniture was sleek and minimalist, arranged with a precision that discouraged anyone from actually sitting on it. Mr. Caldwell values order and quiet, Mrs. Gable explained as they walked through a living room the size of their entire old apartment building. Your primary responsibility is to maintain the household's standards of cleanliness without disturbing the atmosphere. The atmosphere, Grace thought, was one of profound sadness. It clung to the air like a fine dust, settling on every sterile surface. She soon learned the source of it. In a gold-framed photograph on a lonely side table, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stood next to Mr. Caldwell. That was Mrs. Caldwell, Mrs. Gable said, her voice softening for the first time. Eleanor. She passed away 6 months ago, just after the baby was born. The nursery was on the second floor, and it was the saddest room of all. It was filled with the most expensive baby equipment imaginable. A high-tech crib monitored the baby's breathing. A sound machine offered a dozen different types of white noise. Educational toys in muted, tasteful colors were arranged on shelves, untouched. Everything was perfect. Everything was sterile. Everything was unused. And in the center of it all, in that state-of-the-art crib, lay Leo Caldwell. He was a tiny thing, his face red and clenched from constant crying. It wasn't the sound of a fussy baby. It was a deep, guttural wail of pure misery. A nanny with a tired, defeated expression was rocking the crib mechanically, her face a blank mask of resignation. "He has been this way for months," Mrs. Gable whispered, as if the baby could understand. "Since we lost Eleanor. The doctors say he is failing to thrive. He doesn't sleep. He barely eats. Mr. Caldwell has hired the best nannies, the top specialists. Nothing works." Grace watched from the doorway, her heart aching for the tiny, screaming infant. She had never seen a baby so alone in a room so full of things. He wasn't crying for a toy or a bottle. He was crying for a person. Mr. Caldwell established a strict set of protocols for his care. Mrs. Gable continued, handing Laura a thick binder. They were developed by his late wife. Feeding schedules, sleep training methods, approved developmental activities. They are to be followed to the letter. Mr. Caldwell believes that structure is the key to solving the problem. But as the days turned into weeks, Grace saw that the structure was the problem. The nannies came and went, each one armed with the binder and a fresh wave of professional optimism that quickly crumbled into exhausted defeat. One tried the cry-it-out method, which resulted in the baby screaming until he was hoarse. Another insisted on a rigid feeding schedule that Leo's tiny, stressed stomach consistently rejected. Mr. Caldwell himself was a ghost in his own home. He would appear for the scheduled interaction times, holding Leo with a stiff awkwardness, his face a portrait of pained duty. He would read from a bored book in a flat monotone, or dangle a scientifically approved toy that Leo would ignore, his tiny face still crumpled in misery. The baby never calmed in his father's arms. If anything, his cries grew more desperate, as if he could sense the grief and helplessness radiating from the man. Grace was supposed to be invisible, and she tried her best. She did her homework in their small room, read books from the local library, and helped her mother with small chores in the staff wing. But the baby's cries were a constant, haunting presence. They echoed through the vents, a soundtrack of suffering that she couldn't escape. She watched the nannies try everything the binder suggested. They swaddled him. They used the noise machine. They followed the feeding charts. They treated him like a machine that needed to be calibrated. But no one just held him. No one walked with him or hummed a simple, tuneless song. No one seemed to realize he wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a baby who needed to be loved. One evening, after another nanny had quit in a storm of tears and frustration, the house fell into a new level of chaos. Mrs. Gable was out on an urgent errand, and Laura was tasked with watching Leo while trying to prepare Mr. Caldwell's dinner. The baby's screams were piercing, relentless. Laura walked him, rocked him, and offered him a bottle, but nothing worked. Exhausted and on the verge of tears herself, she finally laid him in the crib for just a moment to keep the dinner from burning. Grace stood in the nursery doorway, hidden from her mother's view. She watched the tiny baby thrash in his crib, his face a terrifying shade of red, his tiny fists beating the air. And in that moment, she heard her great-grandfather's words in her head, spoken through her mother's stories. True strength isn't about how hard you can fight. It's about how much you're willing to carry for someone else. She looked at the miserable, lonely baby, and then she thought of the soft, olive-green fabric tucked away in a box in her room. It was a crazy idea, a dangerous idea. It broke every rule Mrs. Gable had laid out. But listening to that baby's heartbroken sobs, she knew it was the only right thing to do. She crept back to her room and opened the velvet box. With trembling fingers, she lifted out the lining of her great-grandfather's jacket. It felt soft and strong in her hands. She tiptoed back to the nursery. Her mother was in the kitchen, her back turned. With a speed and certainty she didn't know she possessed, Grace lifted the screaming baby from his crib. He was surprisingly light. She held him against her chest, whispering the same nonsense words her mother used to soothe her. "It's okay, little one. It's okay. I've got you." Then, remembering the pictures she'd seen in a history book, she carefully wrapped the flannel lining around him and herself, tying it securely. It wasn't perfect, but it was snug. Leo's tiny body sagged against hers, his cries stuttering to a stop. He was still tense, still hiccuping with leftover sobs, but the screaming had ended. Grace began to walk, pacing the length of the nursery with a slow, steady rhythm. She hummed a lullaby she barely remembered, the melody simple and repetitive. She felt the baby's rigid little body begin to relax against her own. He burrowed his face into her shoulder, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the mansion, the nursery was quiet. He wasn't a problem. He was just a baby, and all he had needed was to be held, to be carried. The secret started that night. It became their silent routine. Whenever Laura was busy and a nanny wasn't present, Grace would sneak into the nursery. She would lift Leo from his cold, empty crib and secure him to her back or chest with her great-grandfather's sling. The effect was instantaneous. The baby, who fought and screamed against everyone else, would melt against her. With Leo nestled against her, Grace would do her homework at the nursery desk or quietly read a book in the rocking chair. Sometimes, she would walk through the quiet upper floors of the mansion, her soft footsteps a soothing rhythm for the sleeping infant. She discovered he loved the hum of the dishwasher and the gentle swish of her mother polishing the grand staircase. He was fascinated by the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams that streamed through the massive windows. The changes in Leo were subtle at first, then dramatic. He started finishing his bottles, held in Grace's steady arms. He began to sleep for longer stretches, lulled by the gentle motion of her movements. The constant, desperate crying that had been the mansion's heartbeat faded, replaced by hours of peaceful quiet. He even started to gain weight. Laura noticed immediately. She would walk into the nursery to find Leo sleeping soundly, a sight so rare it felt like a miracle. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered to Grace one afternoon, her face a mixture of relief and confusion. "It's like a storm has passed." Grace never told her the truth. She knew her mother would be terrified of the consequences. This was their only chance, their only home. They couldn't risk it. So she kept her secret locked away, a precious, dangerous thing. She would hide the sling the moment she heard footsteps approaching, laying a now-sleeping Leo back in his crib just in time. Mrs. Gable was baffled but pleased. "Whatever the new formula is doing, it seems to be working," she remarked to Laura, seeing the positive changes in the baby's daily reports. The only person who remained unaware was Harrison Caldwell. He was consumed by a crisis at his company, working longer and longer hours. When he was home, he saw only the results. A baby who was finally sleeping through his scheduled visits, a mansion that was finally quiet. He assumed his rigid protocols were, at long last, yielding results. He credited his late wife's research, never once imagining the truth. He never imagined that his son's salvation was coming not from an expensive specialist or a scientific method, but from the quiet, rule-breaking compassion of his housekeeper's 11-year-old daughter. The calm, however, was destined to be shattered. One afternoon, Grace grew bolder. Leo was particularly alert and happy, cooing and babbling against her back as she explored the house. She wandered into the enormous and used kitchen, deciding to get a glass of water. She felt a surge of pride, looking at the healthy, happy baby she was caring for. She was doing what all those trained professionals could not. She was healing him. She was so lost in the moment, so focused on Leo's soft babbling, that she didn't hear the front door open. She didn't hear the heavy, determined footsteps on the marble floor. She didn't realize anything was wrong until the cold, furious voice sliced through the quiet air. What is the meaning of this? Harrison Caldwell had come home early, his face etched with the stress of a disastrous day, and he had walked right into the middle of her secret. The silence that she had so carefully nurtured in his son was about to be replaced by a storm of his own making, a storm that would change all of their lives forever. Laura rushed forward, her hands still damp, leaving wet prints on the pristine floor. "Mr. Caldwell, it's my fault. I asked her to watch him for just a second while I tended to the stove. I turned my back for a moment, and she decided to tie him to her back like a papoose?" Harrison's voice was laced with a venomous sarcasm. He took another step forward, his expensive leather shoes silent on the stone. "In this house, my son, do you have any idea how dangerous that is? He could have suffocated. He could have fallen." Every word was a hammer blow. Grace felt her own breath catch in her throat. She hadn't thought of those things. She had only thought of the baby's crying, of the deep, lonely sadness in his screams. She had only wanted to make it stop. "He's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first time she had ever spoken directly to Mr. Caldwell. Harrison's head snapped towards her, his eyes narrowing. "You will not speak to me. You will take my son off your back, place him in his crib, and then you and your mother will wait for me in my office." The finality in his tone was terrifying. Laura's face went pale. "Sir, please. She's just a child. She didn't mean any harm." "I am not interested in her intentions," he clipped, his jaw tight. "I am interested in the safety of my son." He reached for Leo, his movements sharp and angry. But as his hands got close, something happened that no one expected. Leo, who had been watching the scene with wide, calm eyes, seemed to sense the tension radiating from his father. His tiny face crumpled. A small whimper escaped his lips. He turned his head away from his father's outstretched hands and buried his face deeper into the crook of Grace's neck, his little hand grabbing a fistful of her t-shirt. It was a small gesture, but it was a clear and powerful rejection. Harrison froze, his hands hovering in the air. For the first time, a crack appeared in his furious armor. He stared at his son, clinging to this stranger, this child of his housekeeper, seeking comfort and safety from her. The sight was a profound, personal insult. It was a visible sign of his own failure. He, the father, was a source of fear. This girl was a source of peace. The unfairness of it all stoked his anger into a white-hot flame. "I said, give him to me," he commanded, his voice shaking with a barely controlled rage. Grace knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that if she handed Leo over now, the screaming would start again. The fragile peace she had worked so hard to build would be shattered. She held her ground, her small body tensed. "If you yell," she said, her voice a little stronger this time, "you'll scare him." The audacity of the statement struck Harrison dumb for a second. This child, this employee, was telling him how to behave around his own son. "Grace, stop it," Laura pleaded, her eyes wide with terror. She grabbed her daughter's arm, trying to pull her away. "Do what Mr. Caldwell says. Right now." But Grace couldn't move. Leo's little body was trembling against hers. She could feel his quiet, trusting weight, and it gave her a strength she didn't know she had. It was the same feeling she got when she held her great-grandfather's medals. A feeling of duty, a feeling of honor. "He doesn't like loud noises," Grace explained, looking directly at Harrison. Her gaze was steady, her blue eyes filled not with defiance, but with a simple, unshakable truth. "And he doesn't like being alone in his crib. It makes him sad. And you're an expert in child psychology now, are you?" Harrison sneered, though the force behind his words was lessened by the tremor of confusion in his eyes. "No," Grace said simply. "I just listen." The kitchen fell silent, the words hanging in the air. "I just listen." It was an indictment of every specialist, every nanny, every book, and every protocol he had relied on. It was an indictment of him. He had tried to manage his son's grief like a corporate merger, with strategies and data points. He had never once thought to just listen. Laura used the moment of shocked silence to act. "Grace, honey, let's untie him now," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She began fumbling with the knot Grace had tied. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the fabric loose. As the sling loosened, Leo began to fuss. He whimpered, his little legs kicking. The moment the sling was completely undone and Laura tried to take him, the whimpers turned into a full-blown wail. It was the sound Harrison knew all too well. The raw, inconsolable scream of misery that had been the soundtrack to his life for the past 6 months. Laura tried to soothe him, bouncing him in her arms, but the baby arched his back, his face turning a blotchy red, his tiny hands reaching back towards Grace. "See," Grace whispered, her heart breaking for the baby. Harrison stared, his anger warring with a new, unwelcome feeling, doubt. Everything the girl had said was proving to be true, right before his eyes. He had come home to a quiet house for the first time in months. He had found his son calm and content. And now, with the girl's strange methods undone, the chaos had returned instantly. He was a man who believed in results. The results were undeniable, but the method was unacceptable. It was foreign. It was low class. It was something a person without means or education would do. It couldn't possibly be the right way. "Put him in his crib," Harrison ordered Laura, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He needed to restore order. He needed to regain control. With an apologetic look at Grace, Laura carried the screaming baby upstairs to the nursery. The piercing cries echoed down the hallway, each one a fresh accusation against him. Harrison turned his gaze back to Grace, who stood by the counter, clutching the faded green fabric in her hands. "My office. Now," he said, turning on his heel without waiting for a reply. Harrison Caldwell's office was like the rest of the house, large, minimalist, and cold. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, its surface empty except for a sleek laptop and a single, framed photograph of his late wife, Eleanor. Grace stood in the middle of the expensive rug, feeling like a tiny boat in a vast, empty ocean. Her mother stood beside her, her head bowed, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. Harrison sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled. The baby's cries could still be heard, a faint, desperate sound from the floor above. "You broke the rules," he began, his voice calm again, but it was the calm of a frozen lake. "Dangerous and deep. The rules your mother agreed to. The rules that were put in place to ensure my son's well-being." "I know, sir," Laura whispered. "And I am so sorry. It will not happen again. We will pack our things." "No," Harrison said, and the word surprised them both. "You will not pack your things. You will do your job. And your daughter," he said, fixing his gaze on Grace, "will never go near my son again. Am I understood?" Grace nodded, her eyes on the floor. She felt a profound sense of loss. She would miss the quiet moments with Leo, the feeling of his warm body against hers, the simple joy of seeing him smile. She had done something good, something that worked, and she was being punished for it. "And that thing," Harrison said, gesturing with his chin toward the fabric in her hands. "What is it? Where did you get it?" Grace looked down at the olive green flannel. It was just a piece of cloth to him. To her, it was everything. "It was my great-grandfather's," she said quietly. Harrison raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "And who was he?" "He was a soldier," Grace said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke of him. "Sergeant Thomas Jensen. He won the Medal of Honor." The name didn't seem to register with Harrison. He was a man who dealt with titans of industry and world leaders. The name of a long-dead sergeant meant nothing to him. "A soldier," he repeated, his tone dismissive. "And he used this cloth for what?" "To carry his men," Grace said, her chin lifting. "The ones who were hurt. The story says he used his jacket to make a sling for a soldier who couldn't walk and carried him back to safety. My mom says it's about how much you're willing to carry for someone else." She said the words with such simple, heartfelt conviction that they seemed to momentarily pierce Harrison's wall of grief and anger. He looked at the photograph of his wife on his desk. Eleanor had been the carrier in their family. She had carried the hope for their child. She had carried the social burdens of his life. And in the end, she had carried the illness that took her from them with a quiet grace he had never understood. After she was gone, He didn't know how to carry anything, least of all the overwhelming weight of his own sorrow or the fragile life of his infant son. He looked back at the small girl in front of him. She spoke of carrying people as an act of honor, a legacy passed down from a hero. He had seen it as a primitive, dangerous act. For the first time, he felt a sliver of shame. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar sting of his grief. Eleanor had left him with a plan, a binder full of research, schedules, and expert opinions. It was the last piece of her he had left, her logic, her order. To abandon it felt like betraying her memory. Sticking to the plan was his way of holding on to her. A noble story, he said, his voice once again cool and distant. But this is not a battlefield. My son is not a wounded soldier. He is an infant who requires a structured, scientific approach to his care, an approach his mother designed. We will be adhering to that approach. Exclusively. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. You are dismissed. Laura, I expect the house to be spotless. Grace, I expect you to be invisible. As they walked out of the office, the sound of Leo's crying seemed to grow louder, a desperate, unanswered plea that followed them down the hall. The days that followed were a special kind of torture for Grace. The house returned to its former state of misery. A new nanny was hired, a stern, older woman named Agnes who believed firmly in the cry-it-out method detailed in Mrs. Caldwell's binder. Leo's screams once again became the constant, heartbreaking soundtrack of the mansion. Grace would lie in her bed in the staff quarters, pressing a pillow over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sound. She felt his distress as if it were her own. Every cry was a nail scraping against her soul. She followed the rules. She stayed in her room. She did her homework. She polished her great-grandfather's medals until they shone, her tears sometimes falling on the cool metal. She was invisible, but she wasn't deaf. The change in Leo was devastating. He stopped eating again. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. The happy, gurgling baby she had come to know was gone, replaced by a tense, miserable infant who flinched at every touch. Even Harrison, secluded as he was, couldn't ignore it. The nightly reports from Nanny Agnes were a litany of failures. Subject refused 8 p.m. feeding. Subject cried for 3 consecutive hours. Subject shows signs of increasing distress. He grew more haggard, his face etched with worry and sleeplessness. He would sometimes stand outside the nursery door, his hand on the knob, listening to his son's agonized cries, his expression a mask of helpless frustration. He was following the plan. He was honoring his wife's memory. Why was it failing? One afternoon, about a week after the incident, Grace was sitting in her room, trying to read a book. The window was open, and the sound of Leo screaming from the nursery on the second floor was horribly clear. She couldn't take it anymore. She put the book down and walked quietly to her mother's room. Laura was folding laundry, her movements weary, her face etched with a sadness that mirrored Grace's own. "Mom," Grace said, her voice low, "we can't let him do this. The baby is sick with sadness." Laura sighed, pressing a freshly folded towel to her chest. "There's nothing we can do, honey. We need this job." "You heard what he said." "But it's wrong," Grace insisted. "Great-grandpa wouldn't have just followed orders if he knew they were wrong. He would have done something." The comparison struck a chord with Laura. She looked at her daughter, at the fierce, determined set of her jaw, and she saw the ghost of the family hero looking back at her. "This isn't a war, Grace. Isn't it?" Grace countered. "Leo is fighting for his life, and he's losing." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The crying from the nursery went on, a thin, reedy wail that seemed to be getting weaker. Sometime after midnight, it finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was heavy and empty and terrifying. An hour later, a frantic knock sounded on their door. It was Mrs. Gable, her face pale, her usual composure completely gone. "Laura, wake up. It's the baby. He's not breathing right. Nanny Agnes is on the phone with the doctor, but Mr. Caldwell wants you up there." He's not responding." Laura threw on a robe and ran out the door. Grace, her heart pounding in her chest with a cold, terrifying dread, crept out of her room and followed, hiding in the shadows of the long, dark hallway. The unthinkable was happening, and it was all Harrison Caldwell's fault. The nursery was a scene of controlled chaos. The lights were on, casting harsh shadows across the room. Nanny Agnes was by the window, her back to the room, speaking in a high, panicked voice into the phone. Yes, his breathing is shallow. No, he's not blue, but he's so pale. An ambulance? Mr. Caldwell doesn't want to. Harrison stood over the crib, a statue carved from fear. He was a man who commanded boardrooms, who moved markets with a single decision. But here, in the face of his son's fragile life, he was utterly powerless. His hands hovered over Leo's small, still form, afraid to touch him, as if his very presence was a poison. Leo was limp against the silk sheets, his chest barely moving. His eyes were closed, his face a waxy, unnatural color. The only sound from him was a faint, hitching gasp every few seconds. Laura was at Harrison's side, her own fear a palpable thing. "Sir, we should call the ambulance," she urged, her voice trembling. "Whatever the doctor says, we can't wait." "No," Harrison said, his voice a choked whisper. "No media, no spectacle. Eleanor." Eleanor had a plan for every contingency. He gestured wildly at the binder, which lay open on the changing table. There must be something in there. A protocol. He was clinging to the binder like a holy text, his faith in its pages the only thing keeping him from shattering completely. To admit the binder was useless now would be to admit his wife's legacy was a failure, that his adherence to it had brought his son to this precipice. From her hiding spot down the hall, Grace could see it all. She saw the nanny's panic, her mother's desperation, and Mr. Caldwell's terrifying, frozen helplessness. Most of all, she saw Leo. Tiny, silent Leo, looking smaller and more fragile than ever in that enormous, sterile crib. He looked just like the wounded soldier in her great-grandfather's story. Pinned down, abandoned, waiting for a rescue that wasn't coming. And in that moment, something inside her snapped. The fear she had felt for a week, fear of Mr. Caldwell, fear of losing their home, was burned away by a ferocious, protective fire. Rules didn't matter. Orders didn't matter. Only Leo mattered. She walked out of the shadows. Her soft footsteps on the plush runner were silent, but her presence was a sudden, shocking shift in the room's energy. All three adults turned to look at her as she walked to the center of the nursery. "Grace," Laura gasped, a fresh wave of fear washing over her face. "Go back to your room. Now." But Grace ignored her. Her eyes were fixed on Harrison. "You're letting him go," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the panic in the room. "You're standing there, reading a book, while he's leaving." The accusation struck Harrison with the force of a physical blow. "Get out of here," he snarled, his grief twisting into a raw, defensive anger. "This is not your concern." "He is my concern," Grace shot back, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. She took a step closer to the crib. "He needs to be held. He needs to feel a heartbeat. He's forgetting how to be alive because he thinks he's all alone." Before anyone could stop her, she reached into the crib. Her touch was gentle but sure. She slid one hand under Leo's neck and the other under his small body, lifting him from the mattress. He was terrifyingly limp, his head lolling back. "Put him down," Harrison roared, lunging forward. But Laura, seeing the absolute certainty on her daughter's face, acted on pure instinct. She put a hand on Harrison's arm, holding him back for just a second. "Wait," she pleaded, not knowing why. "Just wait." Grace held Leo against her chest, his small, pale face just under her chin. She could feel the faint, fluttery rattle of his breathing against her own skin. She began to sway, a slow, rhythmic rock from side to side. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered, her voice a low, calming hum. "I'm here. You're not alone. I've got you. You just have to breathe with me. That's all you have to do." She walked around the room, her steps measured and steady. She hummed the same simple, tuneless lullaby she always had. It was a song of quiet strength, of stubborn hope. She ignored the frantic nanny, her distraught mother, and the furious, broken man watching her every move. The world shrank until it was just her and the baby in her arms. She didn't know how long she walked. 1 minute. 5. 10. To the frantic adults in the room, it felt like an eternity. Harrison watched, his heart a block of ice in his chest, ready to call her a fool, ready to tear his son from her arms. And then, it happened. A small, shuddering breath from Leo. It was deeper than the ones before. Then another, and another. A tiny bit of color began to return to his cheeks. His eyelids fluttered. He made a small, mewing sound, and his head shifted, nuzzling into the warmth of Grace's neck. His tiny hand, which had been limp at his side, twitched and then weakly clutched the collar of her pajamas. He was breathing. Slowly, shallowly, but steadily. He was breathing with her. The room was utterly silent except for the sound of their shared breaths. Nanny Agnes had hung up the phone, her hand over her mouth in disbelief. Laura was crying softly, tears of relief streaming down her face. Harrison sank into the expensive glider in the corner of the room, his legs giving out from under him. He stared at the girl and his son, a single unit of quiet comfort in the middle of the room he had designed to be a pinnacle of modern childcare. Everything he had believed, everything he had enforced, everything he had done to honor his wife's memory was wrong. His structure, his rules, his binder full of science, it had all nearly killed his child. This 11-year-old girl, with nothing but a quiet voice and a steady heartbeat, had just saved him. Grace continued to walk until Leo's breathing was deep and even, until he was sound asleep in her arms. She finally stopped in front of Harrison. She looked down at him, her expression not triumphant, but deeply, profoundly sad for all the time he had lost, for all the pain they had all endured. He just needed to be carried, she said softly. Harrison looked up at her, his face stripped bare of its anger and pride. He looked broken. He saw not the housekeeper's daughter, but a small, blonde guardian angel who had walked out of the shadows to save them both. He finally understood. It wasn't about the science, or the schedules, or the expensive equipment. It was about connection. It was about a human touch. It was about love. "Thank you," he whispered, the words feeling foreign and inadequate in his mouth. "Thank you." The events of that night changed everything. The first thing Harrison did the next morning was fire Nanny Agnes. The second thing he did was take the thick binder of protocols, walk it out to the stone fireplace on the patio, and burn it. He watched the pages curl and turn to black ash, a symbolic funeral for a rigid, lifeless approach to love. He then called Mrs. Gable into his office and gave her a new set of instructions, his voice quiet but firm. "From now on, Grace Jensen has unrestricted access to Leo. She is to be considered his primary caregiver, alongside her mother. Any and all rules regarding her presence in the house are hereby revoked. She is to be treated as a member of this family. Is that understood?" Mrs. Gable, who had heard the story of the previous night's events in hushed tones from Laura, simply nodded, a look of profound respect in her eyes. "Perfectly, sir." The change in the household was immediate and dramatic. Grace was no longer a ghost. She was a presence. With Leo tied safely to her back in her great-grandfather's sling, she moved freely through the mansion. The silence of the house was replaced not with crying, but with her soft humming and the baby's happy gurgles. She taught Harrison how to hold his own son. "You have to relax," she told him one afternoon, as he sat stiffly in a chair while she showed him how to tie the sling. "He can feel it when you're tense. It scares him." Harrison, a man who commanded thousands of employees, meekly took instruction from the 11-year-old girl. He learned to soften his touch, to quiet his voice. He learned to walk with Leo, to feel the rhythm of his own steps soothe his child. For the first time, when Harrison held him, Leo didn't cry. He looked up at his father's face with a dawning sense of recognition and trust. Harrison started coming home from work earlier. He canceled meetings. He postponed business trips. He would spend hours just sitting in the nursery, watching Grace play with Leo on the floor, marveling at the simple, effortless bond they shared. He was a student in his own home, learning a language of care he had never known existed. He also became intensely curious about Grace. He asked her about her life, about her school, and he asked her about her great-grandfather. One rainy Saturday, he asked her to show him the medals. Grace brought the velvet box to the living room and carefully laid it open on the large coffee table. Harrison picked up the Medal of Honor, its weight surprisingly heavy in his hand. "Tell me the story again," he said. "The one about the jacket." Grace recounted the tale, her voice filled with pride. She told him how Sergeant Jensen had refused to leave his men, how he had braved enemy fire to carry them to safety. As she spoke, Harrison was typing the name Sergeant Thomas Stonewall Jensen into his laptop. He was a man who believed in research, and for the first time, he was researching something that truly mattered. He read the official citation for the medal. He read old newspaper articles about the local hero. He read about the platoon, and the battle, and the quiet, unassuming man who had returned home and never spoken of his own bravery. He found an old photograph online of the sergeant receiving his medal at the White House. He was a young man with a kind, determined face and honest eyes. They were the same eyes that looked back at him from across the coffee table. An idea began to form in Harrison's mind, a way to honor the legacy that had, in a very real sense, saved his own family. It was ambitious. It was unorthodox. But it felt right. It felt like the only way he could possibly repay the debt he owed this extraordinary little girl. He looked at Grace, who was carefully placing the medal back in its velvet box. He looked at the faded, olive-green fabric of the sling, which was draped over a nearby chair, waiting for its next duty. Strength wasn't about how hard you could fight, she had told him. It was about how much you were willing to carry for someone else. He was finally ready to start carrying his own weight. Harrison Caldwell was a man who built an empire on logistics, on understanding how to move things from one point to another efficiently. For the next 2 weeks, he applied that same relentless focus to a different kind of project. He wasn't moving cargo, he was moving history. He hired a team of private researchers, the same kind he used for corporate acquisitions, and tasked them with finding everything they could about Sergeant Thomas Stonewall Jensen and the men of his platoon. The mission, he told his team, was of the utmost priority. The reports that came back were more than just dry historical facts. They were stories of real people. They found the grandson of the young soldier Sergeant Jensen had carried in his makeshift sling. The man was now in his 70s, a retired fire chief living in Ohio. He wept on the phone when Harrison's researcher called him, and he told them a story his grandfather had told him countless times. He said he would have died in that mud if it wasn't for Tom Jensen. The fire chief said, his voice thick with emotion. He said Jensen had the kindest, bravest eyes he'd ever seen. My grandfather named his first son Thomas, you know. They found other stories, too. They uncovered letters Sergeant Jensen had written home to his wife, letters filled not with the horrors of war, but with descriptions of the French countryside and longing for his family. They learned he had been a carpenter before the war, a man who built things with his hands. After the war, he had gone back to his quiet life, never seeking recognition, deflecting any praise by saying, "I just did what anyone would have done." Harrison read these stories late into the night in his cold, quiet office, with the sound of Leo's soft, even breathing coming through the baby monitor on his desk. He was piecing together the life of the man whose legacy had saved his son. He was a man of quiet strength, of profound humility, and unwavering duty. He was everything Harrison, with all his wealth and power, was not. And Harrison found himself filled with a deep, humbling admiration. During this time, life in the mansion was transformed. The oppressive sadness that had clung to the walls was gone, replaced by a light and warmth that radiated from the nursery. Grace, with Leo often sleeping peacefully on her back, became Harrison's shadow. He took her and the baby to the park. He had a swing set installed in the immaculate backyard. He read board books to his son, with Grace sitting beside them, pointing out the pictures and making the animal sounds that made Leo giggle. He was learning how to be a father, and his teacher was a child. He saw the world differently through her eyes. She found wonder in the smallest things, the way the sunlight hit the lake in the morning, the taste of the fresh strawberries the cook bought from the farmer's market. She taught him that a home wasn't about pristine surfaces and minimalist furniture. It was about laughter and comfort and the quiet, steady presence of love. Laura watched the transformation in her employer with a quiet sense of awe. He began to speak to her, not just at her. He asked about her life, about her dreams. He insisted she eat her meals with them at the massive dining room table, a suggestion that at first made her deeply uncomfortable but soon became a cherished ritual. The lines between employer and employee were blurring, replaced by the tentative, fragile foundations of a family. Finally, after 2 weeks of intense research and planning, Harrison was ready. He approached Laura and Grace one evening as they were finishing dinner. "I need to ask a favor of you both," he said, his tone formal, yet with an undercurrent of genuine warmth. "There is an event I would like you to attend with me in 2 days. A ceremony. It's important. To me and to our family." He looked at Grace when he said the word family, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. He told them it was a formal event and had arranged for dresses to be delivered. When the boxes arrived, Laura gasped. Inside were two beautiful, elegant gowns, a deep sapphire blue for her, and a soft, pale yellow for Grace. They were the most beautiful things either of them had ever owned. On the day of the ceremony, a black car arrived to take them to a local community hall in a nearby town, the very town where Thomas Jensen had lived and died. Grace was confused. She had assumed the event would be in the city, at some fancy hotel. This place was simple, unpretentious. The parking lot was filled not with luxury cars, but with pickup trucks and sensible sedans. When they walked inside, the hall was filled with people. Older people mostly. Men in old military uniforms, their backs a little straighter today, their medals polished and pinned to their chests. Women in their Sunday best. Harrison, holding Leo in his arms, led Grace and a bewildered Laura to seats in the front row. On the stage at the front of the hall was a simple podium and a large, draped object. The mayor of the town walked to the podium and welcomed everyone. He spoke of the town's pride in its local heroes, and then he introduced the man who had organized and funded the day's event, Harrison Caldwell. Harrison handed Leo to a beaming Laura and walked onto the stage. He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the people who had known and loved the man who had changed his life. He looked at Grace, her blue eyes wide with confusion and wonder. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am not from here. Until a few weeks ago, I had never heard of your town, and I had never heard the name of Sergeant Thomas Jensen." He paused, letting the words settle. "I came to know his name because of his great-granddaughter, Grace." He smiled at her. "Most of you know the official story of Sergeant Jensen's heroism. You know he was awarded the Medal of Honor for saving the men in his platoon. What you may not know is that his legacy of courage, of compassion, of carrying others when they cannot carry themselves, is still alive. It is alive in this little girl." Harrison's voice cracked with emotion, and he had to pause to compose himself. The entire hall was silent, captivated. "I have a son," he continued, "who, for a time, was lost to me in a sea of grief. I had all the resources in the world, the best doctors, the best science. But none of it worked. My son was fading, and he was saved. He was saved by Grace. She did for my son what her great-grandfather did for his men. She carried him. She held him. She reminded him how to live." He looked directly at Grace. "Your mother told me your family's most sacred relic was the lining of his jacket. But I've learned that's not true. The most sacred relic is you, Grace. You are his legacy." Tears were streaming down Grace's face. Laura held her daughter's hand, her own tears falling freely. "I can never repay the debt I owe you," Harrison said. "But I can make sure that the world does not forget the man who taught you how to be a hero. I can make sure that his name and his story are carried forward." He turned and pulled the drape off the object behind him. It was a bronze statue. It was a life-sized rendering of a young soldier, his face etched with exhaustion but also with fierce determination. He was kneeling, carefully wrapping a makeshift sling around the leg of a wounded comrade. The soldier's face was Thomas Jensen's, taken from the old photographs. It was a monument not to war, but to compassion. A collective gasp went through the room. "This statue," Harrison announced, "will be placed in the center of Town Square. And that is not all. I have spent the last 2 weeks talking to historians, politicians, and the families of the men Sergeant Jensen served with. And so, it is my profound honor to announce the creation of the Sergeant Thomas Jensen Foundation." He went on to explain. The foundation, funded entirely by him, would have 2 missions. First, it would provide college scholarships for the descendants of every single man in Sergeant Jensen's platoon. A murmur of disbelief and joy went through the crowd. Second, it would fund programs all over the country that provided support for new parents and infants, specifically focusing on the importance of human connection, of holding, of carrying. The foundation's motto would be the simple words Grace had spoken to him. "It's about how much you're willing to carry for someone else." The hall erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. The old veterans were weeping. People were hugging each other. In the front row, Laura was holding her daughter, overcome with a joy and pride so immense it felt like it could burst her heart. But Harrison wasn't finished. He held up a hand for quiet. "There is one more thing," he said, stepping down from the stage and walking directly to Grace. He knelt in front of her, so they were eye to eye. He was no longer the billionaire, the titan of industry. He was just a grateful father. "Grace Jensen," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I have a son who needs a sister. And I have a house that needs to be a home. Your mother has agreed, if you will have us. I would like to formally adopt you. I would like you to be my daughter." It was the unthinkable thing. Not the money, not the foundation, not the statue. It was this. He wasn't just rewarding her. He was making her family. He was choosing her. For a moment, Grace was too stunned to speak. She looked at her mother, who was nodding through her tears, her face alight with a happiness Grace had never seen before. She looked at Leo, who was babbling in her mother's arms, reaching a chubby hand out towards her. She looked at this powerful man, kneeling before her, offering her a future she could never have imagined. A father, a brother, a home. "Yes," she whispered, and then she threw her arms around Harrison's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "Yes." He held her tightly, and for the first time in his life, Harrison Caldwell felt truly, completely rich. 1 year later, the mansion is no longer a museum. It is a home. Toys are scattered on the living room rug. Children's drawings are taped to the gleaming refrigerator. The air is filled with the sound of laughter. In the backyard, near the swing set, a small vegetable garden is growing. Harrison, his shirt sleeves rolled up, is on his knees in the dirt, showing a now toddling Leo how to water a tomato plant. Grace, now 12, sits on the grass nearby. She is not watching them. She is focused on a small bundle in her lap. Cradled in the faded, olive-green fabric of her great-grandfather's sling is a tiny, sleeping puppy, a golden retriever they had adopted from the local shelter that morning. She rocks the puppy gently, humming the same lullaby she had sung to Leo. Harrison watches her, a deep, contented smile on his face. He had thought his life was about building an empire, about acquiring things. He had been so wrong. His life was about this. About building a family. About nurturing life. About the quiet, extraordinary power of carrying those you love. Grace looks up and catches his eye. She smiles, a bright, beautiful smile that lights up her whole face. It's a smile that says she is home. A smile that says she is loved. A smile that says she knows her own strength, a strength passed down from a hero, a strength that had healed them all. He had thought he was doing the unthinkable by offering her a new life. But the real unthinkable thing had been done by her. An 11-year-old girl had walked into the cold, empty heart of his life and taught him how to love again. She had carried them all. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.